My name is Amy Janess. I'm Programming Coordinator for the Nantucket Atheneum, and I'm joined by my colleague Janet Forrest. So welcome to tonight's program. I just want to point out that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And if at any point during the presentation you have a question, type it in there. And at the end, there's going to be time for answering questions and discussion with Josh. So feel free to send us your questions as we go along. I'm just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction, and then we'll begin. So Josh Bycer is the owner of Game Wisdom and specializes in examining the art and science of games. He's the author of 20 Essential Games to Study and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers. And tonight, he's going to talk to us about the realities of being a video game maker. So please join me in welcoming Josh Bycer.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Amy. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. If there's any issues, just let me know. Feel free to interrupt me. But thank you so much for everyone watching this, whether you're enjoying this at the live on the channel or in the archived version. But as Amy said, my name is Josh Bycer, and this is one of my presentations I put out about the game industry and game development, and this is the reality of game development. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about in the next hour or so is a realistic look at what it means to make video games for a living, whether or not you're going to be at a major studio, working on your own, and some of the challenges and pitfalls that go with it. To add on to Amy's introduction, I've been doing this now for over 8 years. In that time, I have interviewed developers from all around the world. I think at this point, I'm up to over 600. And this is where a lot of my knowledge and background come from, is I've had a chance to talk to people who have made a living in the industry, who have tried to make a living, and unfortunately, those who have failed. And I'll include links and such to my books at the end of this presentation. But to get started, for tonight, we're going to be talking briefly, or we're going to be talking into various topics. We're going to be starting out with kind of what goes into making a video game. What are your options in terms of developing skills or things to look at in terms of potential career? We're going to be breaking down what it means to work at a major company. That would be at a studio like Nintendo, Electronic Arts, 2K, and other studios, versus being on your own as an independent developer. And that has been one of the major kind of segs, or one of the big differences between the industry in the last decade. And we're going to kind of talk about what is happening right now, or kind of what's happening right now is everyone knows we're in the middle of a pandemic, which makes some of this a little hard to predict. But I will also have reference materials and sites that you can visit on your own if you want to pursue your knowledge further. Now, what we're not going to be covering, and this is very important, we're not going to be talking about what colleges or schools you should attend. One of the big things about the industry is that there is no one right way to get in. I have spoken to people who have gone in by working at major companies. I've seen students who decide to work after hours at school to start their first game. I've even spoke to a couple who lived in a tree house for about 3 years designing their first title. We won't be discussing kind of interviews, resumes, or portfolios for that same reason. Everyone has different skills. Everyone has different requirements. Those last 2 points are also very important. There is no perfect guide to making a video game. For as many developers are in this world, there are as many different ways of designing a game. Likewise, if I had the perfect guide to becoming rich making games, I would be giving talks all around the world at this moment. But let's start with some good news. Why this is the best time to get into the game industry. When I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, video games and the game industry in general were considered toys. It was, a pop culture fad. Nobody was going to get into it. It was considered, foolish, or, the throwaway career if you want to try and make games for a living. And over the course of the past 20 years, that perception has changed permanently. The last 20 years brought both a standardization to what it means to make video games, as well as the growing acceptance that video game culture and development are here to stay, and they are only going to get bigger. The game industry today is now, I think, like a multi-billion or even a multi-trillion dollar industry, and just in terms of how much money is going around. Education options have opened up. When I was in college back in the mid thousands, most schools outside of specialty colleges or art programs didn't even think about covering the game industry in any aspect. Today, we are seeing more options being developed, and we're even seeing more discussions around esports. And that is an entirely other universe from this presentation and something that I cover in another topic. But one of the biggest points has been the growth of the independent scene. This has been pivotal in kind of the growing acceptance and just mainstream nature of game development. 20 years ago and beyond that, the only ways you were going to make a video game were that you were going to have to work at a major company because no store would put some random person's game on there. Over the last 10 years, with the rise of digital distribution and online platforms, it's now possible for almost literally anyone to make video games and put them up for other people to see. You are not locked or held away from a Walmart or a Target or any other mainstream store saying that, no, we don't want your game. And this has been huge in terms of allowing people to not only try their hand development, but in some cases make a career or living off of it. Another big point has been the use of public game engines. Again, 20 or 30 years ago, you really didn't have the options or the tools to be able to make your own video game. And you had to either know somebody or work at a company or have a strong enough programming background to build your own engine. And near the end of this presentation, I'll be showing off a few of the many examples of public game engines that you can literally download the second you're done watching this and start messing around with and see if you can make something with it. And here are just a few, and I do mean a few, of the many independent game examples that have gone on to become massive hits. And one of the fun parts about these presentations is that whenever I show game examples, I would have to update the presentations every 6 months to a year with whatever is the current hot trend. But I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Stardew Valley at this point. One of the more recognizable takes on Harvest Moon and kind of a slice of life game. I'll be surprised if people know of Fez and Darkest Dungeon. Darkest Dungeon probably a little bit too mature for the audience watching this right now. But Fez, it was featured in the movie Indie Game, the movie. I know it's a weird title. And it kind of chronicled the rise of three prolific independent developers. I think it was in 2010, 2011. And that was kind of when we began to see this indie developer movement take root. Another option has been, of course, mobile games. And the mobile scene has also grown in its own unique way over the past probably 10 to 13 years in terms of kind of the rise of the smartphone era. But mobile games are cheaper and they're a little bit easier to design because you're dealing with a more restricted or more limited platform. And it has opened the door for many people to try their hand making smaller titles because of it. Now, the mobile game market has certainly shifted and changed, especially the last 3 years. But here's just a few of these more well-known examples. I'm sure everybody has heard of Angry Birds at this point, but there's also stuff like Clash of Clans, Farmville, and again, the just vast number of mobile games that have been trying to compete for your time and money. But all that, of course, it hinges on you actually learning about game development. And as I said, this is going to be kind of a high level discussion. There is a lot that goes into this. I have made so many videos and talks about game design and game development on my YouTube channel, and there'll be a link to that at the end of this presentation. But getting in this game industry or being successful, it requires a variety of skills. There's been this discussion among developers about, the artist versus the businessman. And this idea that you had to commit to one or the other to succeed. And that's not really true. The developers who do manage to succeed and make a living, they have to wear not only those two hats, but other ones as well. And I'll have a slide coming up in a second that talks more about. In terms of actually running a studio, money has to come from somewhere. And for larger companies, they will usually either finance part of the game themselves, or they will have a publisher providing the bulk of the money or the development funds. Crowdfunding, that is done by sites such as Kickstarter, Fig, Indiegogo, and other ones, has become a very popular option over the last decade. But that bubble has kind of burst over the last 4 to 5 years, give or take. One of the most important lessons that everyone needs to know, and something that even people who have already gone to school or trying to make their first, successful game have to learn, is that no matter how simple you think your game is going to be, it will always take time to make. And this is again why there is no such thing as the one size fits all guide to game development. There are some people who can take months to make a game. There are people who have taken years. I've spoken to some who have spent 3 to 5 years of their life on a game. Some have spent 10 years working on a single title. And again, it is just very hard to kind of pinpoint how to make a game successfully that will work for everyone. But I'm assuming, again, I unfortunately can't see people watching this right now, but I'm assuming that for those of you watching this, you are either, teenagers or you are in school thinking about getting into the game industry. And when we talk about game design from kind of a rough context, there are three distinct areas that go into making a video game. You have the design, you have the coding or programming, and you have the aesthetics. So design would be building the game, coming up with the systems, building what this game is going to be. The coding side is actually creating that game, putting your thoughts to code, being able to design something that people can play with and interact with. And the aesthetics, of course, are going to be the art, the sound, what people are going to experience, either through sight, sound, or even just how they interact with the game. And while those three disciplines are very broad, there is a lot that can be built into it, as you can see here. Now, the skills I have kind of separate at the top are important to talk about because many people don't view marketing or project development or even just being able to, run or manage a team as essential skills. But if you're going to strike out in the independent scene, you don't have the luxury of a big studio, you need to learn these skills. And like I said, like about 5 minutes ago, the people who succeed in game development understand that there's as much art in the business as there is business in the art. And one of my game developer friends told that to me on one of our interviews. It's kind of stuck with me. But as you can see, when we break down design, coding, and aesthetics, there are a lot of different disciplines. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about what it means to work at a major company and be hired in the next few slides. Now, there is something that I'm sure you've noticed, that when I have things listed here, you can see that there's an intersection, and that is important. Many people who get into the game industry will usually dabble in 2 or 3 different disciplines. If they're a programmer, they may also learn about a little bit about art or music. If they're a designer, they could also become an artist or programmer as well. And typically, the people who tend to do well or start to learn how things work understand the different roles. That doesn't mean you're going to be the designer who's also the programmer, who's also the musician, who's also the artist. But it's important to understand all the little aspects that go into game development. Now, there is something that I'm sure people have thought of. I'm sure some of you may be thinking about this yourself. Is there such a thing as a pure designer? Meaning somebody who only understands game design. They're not a programmer, they're not an artist, they are the quote unquote ideas person. The short answer is no. What we've seen over the last 30 plus years in terms of the game industry is that if you're going to get into the game industry, you need a hard skill. You need to be able to show somebody the ideas that are in your head. Now, the screenshots, of course, are from various Mario games. And the reason that I put this up is that Shigeru Miyamoto, who has become credited as one of the most influential people in the game industry, and of course, one of the big names from Nintendo, was an artist. He got into the company doing art and sketches and coming up with characters like that. And then he took on a designer role kind of following that. But again, he has multiple disciplines. Now, if you're going to be on the independent side, most independent developers kind of dabble in everything, especially if you are a 2 or 3 person studio. And like I said, you have to kind of understand or have a secondary skill set if you want to be able to talk with people and manage them in terms of understanding what it means to make games. Now, with that said, the long answer is kind of up in the air. Many people, even inside the game industry who work at major companies, still don't fully grasp or understand the role of game design or being able to understand what this means. And this next part, I'm going to say this, and it's going to make me sound very, conceited, but I am one of the few people out there who talk about game design at this level. Now, there have been more people and more sites and channels that have grown over the last decade, but it's still a very niche club in terms of being able to talk about game design and kind of what it means to interact with games at a very high or very analytical level. So people are starting to understand this. They are starting to realize that just releasing a game randomly is not going to be successful, and that there are clear metrics and areas that you can study that can lead to games being successful, or at least hedge your bet in terms of that game being more profitable. So, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a fortune teller. Maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, things could be changed or things could be different. But for right now, for those of you watching this who are in school or trying to learn, I can't tell you, don't worry about programming or art. You'll just do fine on design. It's not going to work, at least in the near future. So, with that said, we're going to talk a little bit next about what it means to work at a major company versus being an independent developer. Like I said, a big growth of this industry over the last 10 years has been the rise of the independent scene. 20, 30 years ago, you weren't going to do this on your own. There were a few developers who did manage to succeed, but they were few and far between. And it is very much considered acceptable to be an indie developer, and there are several big pros that we'll talk about in the coming slides. But the ultimate discussion about studio versus indie comes down to refinement versus uniqueness. Major companies typically will refine or they will iterate on an idea to make it as perfectly as possible. Is it the most unique game? No. But it's something that's going to be widely accepted, and it's going to be something that you're going to have a pretty good idea of who's going to buy this. Indie development is about making unique titles. They're not going to be the best looking, they're not going to be the most polished, but in terms of getting experience that you have never seen before, you're going to find that in an independent space. And that's why, kind of for myself, that I have shifted towards covering more indies than I have AAA studios over the last 5 to 6 years. But working at a studio is still considered the big leagues. Studios will have employees in the dozens, if not hundreds, if we're talking about major companies like, again, like Activision, 2K, EA, BioWare, and so on. For these major companies, most of the funding is going to come from the publisher themselves. And for many of the AAA companies, what usually ends up happening is a major publisher will either buy them out or buy a majority owning in them, and then they will kind of run things and keep that studio afloat. And when we talk about these kinds of companies, this is where, funding and projects get into the millions and billions easily. And the games that go on to kind of capture the market or capture the consumer's eyes typically come from the AAA. And again, like this example sheet here, this is from about a year or so ago, and I can update this, every few months. I could put, The Last of Us 2 that came out earlier, Animal Crossing, and, even stuff like Fortnite as well. But again, the games that do succeed, they will usually set the tone for the industry and for other studios going forward. With that said, there are some major downsides about working at a major company. First off, the studio culture of major studios usually operates around different teams. So you have your dev team, you have your coders, you have your artists, you have your sound people, you have your testers, etc. And unless you are a lead on a project, you will basically be, part of that faceless crowd. You are a cog in the machine. When you get hired to work at a major studio, you're being hired to do a specific task. If you are hired to, I don't know, render grass in every outdoor environment, I hope you really like rendering grass because that's going to be your job for the foreseeable future. Now, some people are fine with having that very focused position. But if you're hoping, that you're going to be discovered and you will be made the lead on the next project, that is most likely not going to happen. Studio development is, of course, very risky. When we are talking about projects with millions and billions of dollars of funding, if that game doesn't earn revenue, that studio's in deep trouble. And we have seen many horror stories surrounding that. Even companies that have made very prolific or very highly critically and commercially favored titles, they may still go under because of one bad game or due to studio mismanagement or any number of issues. And unfortunately, there are still horror stories to this day of people being overworked, the issue of just being like ground into the dust. And this is a serious point about working at major companies that they may ask you to just work, 70 to 80 hours a week for 6 to 12 months. And this has been a killer for many people who have become burnt out, who have suffered health issues, and who sometimes may have just quit the game industry, never wanted to do it ever again. And for people who get into the game industry, the risks of being permanently hired at a major studio can come back to hurt them. See, what ends up happening is that at major studios, you'll have your core group of people. These are the leads, these are the founders, the people who kind of are the face of that company. They're not going anywhere. When we're talking about a major studio, you are going to need a lot more people to develop a game. And what ends up happening is that probably as we get to the core to the midway point of development, they will put out calls for temporary or contract people to come in. These are the people who are going to actually build this game. And what ends up happening is that when their role is done, they're out. And again, a lot of people dream about being hired after the fact, and this has been used against them in terms of, you're not passionate enough unless you work, the next 6 months, 90 hours a week kind of design. And because of this, it has been one of the major reasons why we've seen this shift towards being an independent developer. That you have the freedom when you are working on your own to do whatever you want. And that right there has been one of the major attractions of the indie scene. I've spoken to developers who have worked at major companies who have quit those jobs to make the games that they want to make. And when you're in that position, you don't have to worry about shareholders. You don't have to worry about, a manager or somebody higher up saying, we don't want you to make this. Over the last 10 years, and especially with the rise of virtual offices, and as we're doing a virtual presentation right now, you don't need a physical space to have a company. I've interviewed people who their office is entirely virtual. Each person in the studio basically is in a different part of the country or even on a different continent, and they're making games. And you can do a lot of the stuff from the comfort of your own home these days. And as I said earlier, being an independent developer has afforded a lot of people to make creative and emotionally driven games, the likes of which would never come from a major company. And again, this is just a small list. I am sure everyone watching this right now knows Minecraft. And while Minecraft is a major name, I remember when it was just some no-name indie title. This was like 2007, 2008, that everyone thought it'll come out and disappear. And it certainly did not. Undertale is a game that has earned a passionate fan base and has propelled the developer Toby Fox into stardom status. Gone Home was one of the most emotionally driven games of the last decade, and it kind of led the way to more of these games telling a story as opposed to just playing them. Firewatch being another example. With that said, though, while I've been, living it up about being an independent developer the last few minutes, there are still some very serious downsides. And unfortunately, I've had to see this kind of from the outside, talking to so many developers over the last 8 years. The big thing is that as a smaller developer, you are going to be very tight in terms of your money. When you work in this game industry, you only get paid, or you will normally only get paid, when that game is done. So if it takes you 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, you are going to be burning money. And unless you get a publisher or people to support you, you are going to have to live while you're trying to make this game. This is often why we see many independent developers take a side job or, maybe work on their game in their spare time. And as a small developer, you are going to have to make do project to project. And we have seen, unfortunately, many developers fail big on one of their games, and that's it. They are out. And the market has become flooded. And we'll talk a little bit more about that over the next few slides. But 30 years ago, it was rare to get, 20 games in a month. Today, we see guarantee about 30 to 40 games being released weekly. Is every game, an amazing 10 out of 10 title? No. But it is flooding the market. And people are expecting more for less from developers these days. And for a lot of people, spending $30, $40 is considered, a faux pas on games. They may wait for your game to be $5 to $10 or less. And unfortunately, it's time to talk about the bad news. This is going to be, the horror story of this presentation. But like I said, there will be good news after this part. But while this has been a really great time, it is a very risky time to get in the game industry. As I said a slide ago, there are 30 to 40 games being released weekly. And the chance of your game being picked up completely out of the blue is minimal. About 10 years ago, it was considered kind of the standard that you have 30 to 45 days from your game being released for it to earn the bulk of its sales in terms of, market recognition. Today, that's down to 10 to 15. The value has dropped, although we have been seeing developers kind of fight back against that in the independent scene. But for a lot of people, they think spending $10 or less is considered okay for a game. But it's very hard to live off of $10 a sale. And then the idea of discoverability kind of is the, I guess, the umbrella or the blanket over all this. That you need people to find your game in order to buy it. And discoverability is very hard. I have a presentation about being successful or trying to be successful in YouTube, and I've struggled with that myself. And for many independent developers, they will do nothing in terms of reaching out to people. They will work on their game for 3 to 4 years, release it, and nobody buys it. And that is not hyperbole. I have spoken to developers who less than 50 people bought their game. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter how great you are at keeping your costs down and working on your game. If less than 50 people have actually purchased it, that is a commercial failure. And I've seen people who've gotten several hundred or several thousand copies of their game sold still fail because that wasn't enough to cover costs. And you need to be able to reach out. You need people to know your game. And like I said a slide ago, the idea that there are so many games being released has led to this idea of race to the bottom, that developers will try to price their game as cheaply as they can in order to earn their revenue in bulk. But what we have seen with so many games being released, that we're starting to see this trend change, and there's a good chance that in the next year or two, I may have to update the slide, as developers have been pushing back against this, that about 3 to 4 years ago, the standard price for an indie game was about $10, and 20 was pushing it. Today, that's going up to about $15 to $20, with 30 to 34 being the high end of the scale. And we could see things get pushed even higher than that. But that final little bubble down there is very important to understand, that the longer you end up making your game, the longer it takes to be made, the riskier or the harder it is to earn back that development. And like I said, I have seen developers spend 12 to 18 months on a game. I've seen them spend 5 to 10 years making a game. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that the longer it takes to make that game, the harder, and in some cases impossible, it becomes to earn a living. And making a living in the game industry is a huge point. I could spend another hour or two rambling on this one topic, because one of the big points, and this is something that for any teenagers or students watching this, you have to understand, is that there's a difference between making video games and making a living off of those games. And a lot of people have struggled with this fact. At the end of the day, money has to be coming in order for you to make a living. And it doesn't matter if everyone who's played your game loves it. If you took a second mortgage down, you can't cover costs, or you don't have enough money to eat over this month. And you have to be able to think about things objectively. I've spoken to developers who have combined like 30 to 40 years of experience in this industry and have made a living off of their games. And it is very tough to do. You have to make tough choices. And sometimes the game you want to make and the game that you're able to make, or the game that you're able to live off of, are two different titles. And why I said earlier that you have to think both as an artist and as a businessman if you want to succeed. And that final point we've said earlier, that even if you think I'm going to make a simple game, it will take me a month and I'll get it out there, it can still balloon in scope. And 1 month can become 3 months, which can become 8 months. And suddenly that simple idea that you thought you could get done in your spare time is now a 5-year long project with no end in sight. And that level of crunch in terms of development has also killed a lot of developers and killed their titles, because you can get stuck in that mindset that this game will never come out. Why should I keep working on it? And as I've said, and again, why the title of this development, the reality of game development, is that it is very risky to do this for a living. If you just want to make games in your spare time, put them up, and you don't care about making money, you can do that. Ignore everything that I've said so far. But if you're trying to say to yourself, I want to earn money, I want to make games that I can live off of, That is a monumental difference. And unfortunately, I've been kind of given front row to the fact that for every game that has succeeded, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that don't. The market is constantly changing. What worked 6 months, a year ago, may not work today. And I have spoken to developers who have made a living over the last decade who have told me just that. There's a famous indie developer, Rami Ishmael, who his company Vombeer blew up over the course of kind of the early 2010s. And I interviewed him earlier this year, and he told me straight up that if he was making the same games that propelled his company to stardom today, he would be done. He would be a complete failure because that market has changed. And so much has to go right for your game to succeed, and very little has to go wrong for it to fail. And unfortunately, I don't think that is going to change because so many people are getting in, and so many people are expecting high quality that you have to do so much to make this work. And this is, again, one of those banner lessons that you need to learn. And if you want to take anything away from this presentation, this is a big one. That if you want to succeed, you need to do more than just make good video games. There was at a time a general thought among developers that just make video games and either A, the game will blow up, or B, you'll do enough that people will find you and you'll be successful. No, that doesn't work anymore. People expect not only quality, they expect you to do a lot of work. And part of that work is getting the word out there. You have to be engaging people on social media. You need to have people look at your game. Play testing, again, like this is one thing I always say about these talks, that every topic that I bring up, there's probably a 2 to 3 hour lesson just in that one topic. Play testing is king. There are people out there who will just design a game in their own little bubble, release, and then wonder why nobody likes it. I heard a horror story from somebody who was watching a friend at a convention show off their game, and every time somebody started to play the game, they would rip the controller out of their hand and say, "You're not doing it right. Let me show you." And that is the worst way to think about your audience. Now, the guy over there having a nervous breakdown is from the Darkest Dungeon. That was a game that I showed you earlier in this presentation. And that one image, I think, is like the perfect summation of being a game developer, being in a constant state of existential dread. And I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. But as I've said, you have to do a lot for your game to succeed. Managing a team, managing a development are also big points. Like I said earlier, if you go beyond, let's say favorably, 3 years of developing a single game, something has gone terribly wrong, whether you want to admit it or not. And being able to look at a project and say objectively, I can do this or I can't do this, are important skills to learn. And one of those skills to learn is failure. Like I've been saying, every game that succeeds, there are hundreds that don't. And another part of the best or the most successful developers is learning not to go all in. That I shouldn't take a second mortgage on my house and quit my job and do nothing for the next 10 years on this crazy idea. And there is an important lesson that will be coming up on the next slide or two that will tell a bit more about that. But the developers who have made a living off of this industry know how to mitigate the risks, be it by doing PR and management, to keeping their costs as low as possible. That they shouldn't spend 8 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars on a crazy idea that may not even work. Now, the game up there in the corner, I'm not sure how much it has gone, public or, mainstream, but that is Cuphead. This was a game that it blew up after Microsoft decided to publish and, get funding for the studio. But they were working on this game for, I think, 4 to 5 years prior on their own. And when Microsoft decided to, step up and say, we're going to publish it, they went all in. They took a second mortgage out on their home to finish this game. And it succeeded. And now the studio, I think it's called Studio NDHR, are famous. But here's the scary part. Just as it could have succeeded, it could have failed as well. Because game development is not 100% guaranteed. I have seen studios do everything right and fail, just as I've seen studios do everything wrong, and they still end up with a successful product. And just as Cuphead could have succeeded, they could have lost their home as well because of it. And I know I'm, scaring. I know this can be considered very scary, but this just comes from the wisdom and the knowledge of speaking to people who have done this. One of the developers I interviewed, this was about 4 years ago, their game failed so badly that I think they were based out of Taiwan or China, that the bank kind of repossessed, or they took over all the assets, and that company is now considered blacklisted and a failure in that country. So the good news is that we are past the scared straight portion of this presentation, and it's time to talk about what you can do now and some of the things you can look at to, again, hedge your bet and mitigate that risks. So the good news is that for all the students and teenagers watching this, starting to figure this stuff out now is going to put you ahead of the game. A lot of the people who got in this game industry over the last 20, 30 years, they were already working at major companies, and they decided to get into the game industry. I've spoken to one developer who was an investment banker who decided one day, I don't want to do this anymore, and he started his own game company. But for you now, you're going to have the advantage of the resources and be able to see people who have made a living to learn what they've done right and wrong. And one of the big things that you can do now is figure out what aspect of game development you want to focus on. Like I said on that little slide or that presentation I showed you earlier in terms of design, aesthetics, coding, figuring out what part of being in the studio or being in game development now will save you a lot of headache later on down the line. Try to learn programming. If it works for you, see where you can go with it. If you hate it, go down another route. It's better to do this now while you're in school than when you're, 35, 40, and you're trying to, keep your household and still experiment with learning about games. And a big point, again, start dabbling in these aspects. Start building a portfolio. There are, in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some of the places where you can post your games or where games can be put up and see what people think. Start building a name for yourself. And you also want to take this time to start a kind of fleshing out your skills or kind of broadening your skill set. Start learning about art if you're a programmer. Start doing PR or learning about marketing. And try to find people who you could work with and start complementing your own skill sets. Because the chance of you being able to do everything perfectly is very low. But it's time to talk about some of the good stuff. As I said earlier, a major aspect of this growth of the game development has been the rise of public game engines. And over the next few slides, I'm going to show you some of the more recognizable examples. And all these ones can be downloaded right now. Now, the chance of you immediately making the next 10 out of 10 Game of the Year winning game is very low. But this is how you can start to figure out what aspects of game development you want to do, and also start to get your name out there. And if you can learn this stuff now, it will put you ahead of the game if you're trying to break into the game industry at a major studio, or even just immediately go into indie development. I've spoken to people who, while they're still in high school, are starting to make their own games. It is very possible to do that, especially today. But let's start with our first example. I need to take a quick sip because my throat's starting to dry up. All right, and that is Unity. Unity is one of the most famous game engines today. It has become a very popular option for a majority and a vast amount of indie developers. You can use this to make all manner of games. I'll have a few examples on the next page. And this is entirely free to download. And like I said, you can go to unity3d.com or wherever Unity's main site is now, and you can start working with this. Now, the downside about Unity is that this is still a commercial grade engine, and you're going to need to have a background or learn programming and coding, and especially art, if you intend to make anything. When I tried to use Unity a few years ago, the extent of my ability was basically having a red square jump over a blue circle. That was my programming mastery right there. But why people like Unity is that it allows for a variety of games. Now, some people have snubbed the engine, saying that, oh, it's only used for low quality games, ripoffs. But two of the most beautiful and successful games over the last decade, Hollow Knight on the left and Ori and the Blind Forest on the right, were built with Unity. And again, these games were amazing, and they're just two of the many examples. Now, from a kind of production standpoint, if you do end up using Unity, it is free to work with. But if you intend to sell the game, you will have to buy a license or kind of buy like a commercial version of it. And they will also allow you put a game up for free, but you also have to advertise that this game was made in Unity first. Now, a less complicated but still very attractive option is GameMaker. GameMaker is a lot easier to use than Unity, and part of that is that you don't need as strong of a programming background in order to make use of it. What they use is kind of the symbology or these icons. And if you look on the little screenshot there, you'll see all those little icons right there. And what they do is they each correspond to basically a function. So if you were building, let's say, a platformer in Unity, and you want it to make your character jump, you would need to figure out the code that you want to use. You're going to need to define how all that works. And if you're not familiar with it, it could take a lot of time. With GameMaker, you can just take an icon, the jump function, put it on a character and say, I want you to jump 5 squares high, hit OK. That character is going to jump now. And it has been kind of the stepping stone for a lot of people to get into game development who don't have a strong background in it. A game journalist, I think this was like 4 or 5 years ago, his first game, I believe it was called Gunpoint. He made that entirely in GameMaker, and he had no programming or no game development background, and he was able to make that game on his own. Now, the big disadvantage of GameMaker is that this is limited to, or it's primarily used for 2D games. So, side scrollers, top down ones. If you want to build like a 3D game, this engine is going to be a lot harder, and I don't even know if it's possible to do that in GameMaker. And here are, again, just a few examples of some of the games. The one on the left is Hyper Light Drifter, and the one on the right is Forager. And Forager is a very interesting point. This was built at a game jam. If you don't know what the term is, game jams are kind of limited time contests or little exercises where people get together and they'll build a game around a specific theme, but with a time limit. And they'll build kind of like the prototype or the concept. Forager was so popular and successful that the developer decided to turn that into a full game, and he released it to very big success because of it. Now, if you want to go big, we have Unreal. And the Unreal Engine is right now, pound for pound, the most powerful engine that is available publicly. Many major studios will work with their own company kind of locked engine. Electronic Arts has, I believe, the Frostbite engine as an example. But if you're looking for something that is power that you can get right now, Unreal is it, bar none. And Unreal is becoming more and more of an attractive option as the studio Epic, who are known for Fortnite, have been doing a huge push to get independent developers and people onto their engine. One of the big things they did was they made their engine royalty free, meaning that you can get the engine, you can download it for free, and you can release a game, and they will only ask for money if you sell, I think, 1 million in revenue. And for a lot of developers out there, they are not making $1 million in revenue. But this is it in terms of power. It is very complicated to use. There are books and videos and seminars and webinars and anything like that about making use of Unreal. But if you want to be like 100 steps ahead of the game, if you can learn this engine and make something with it now, that will be fantastic for you going forward. Now, and here are again a few examples. I've already mentioned Fortnite, and the game on the right was a game called Little Nightmares. That was kind of like a horror themed game. And again, the Unreal Engine can be used for just about any kind of game design that you want. Now, with that said, if you're looking for something more razor focused, there is RPG Maker. Now, the difference between RPG Maker and the other examples is that this is something you have to buy. It is a product that allows you to edit and make RPGs. So Final Fantasy, a lot of these old school 8-bit, 16-bit titles as well. And some people have experimented and kind of gone beyond it. Kind of like the two big things about this. The first is that it can be expensive because you buy it kind of a la carte. So every little feature, soundbite, graphic, you have to buy that separately, and that can add up. And this is limited to RPG games. If you want, let's say you want to build a platformer like Mario, RPG Maker will not work for you. This is 100% and only focused on RPGs. And a lot of developers in the industry kind of look down on this because in the time it would take you to make like a commercial grade game in RPG Maker, you could have learned an engine like Unity or Game Maker or use something that is far easier and has a far greater scope of development than using this one. And even with these examples, there are other ones out there as well. But no matter what engine you use, no matter what design you want to have, there is still one lesson when you start out, and that is to fail small. A common lesson or a common anecdote that I hear from a lot of developers, your first game, and I mean literally your first game, should not be your dream game. You need to build up your knowledge of what it means to make games. And the only way you're going to do that is you have to sit down and make them. And this is hard, I think, for a lot of people. The idea in your head is not the same thing that's going to go onto a computer. Projects and games will change. And it's better to figure this stuff out if you're working on a small game as opposed to 6 years and then you realize, I can't finish this game. And it's something that we've even seen major successes do as well. Rovio, as we said earlier, of Angry Birds fame, they had a good 70 to 75 other games that all failed before they struck gold with Angry Birds. And your second or third idea could be that award-winning game. But you have to be able to live off of your titles before then to get to that point. And another reason why you want to fail small is that when you fail, when you release that game, you're going to have the knowledge going forward to your next one. Another common phrase I hear from developers is that the game that I just finished, if I were to go back and make that same exact game now, I would do it in half to 3/4 less the time because of everything that I know now, having built it previously. Now, with that said, if you want to start growing your knowledge and learning more about the game industry, I'm going to give you a few of the many, some like the more professional places to visit, because game development is different from game journalism. For the gamers watching this, you probably know sites like IGN, Kotaku, Destructoid, or watch popular gaming or video game YouTubers. That information is not the same as making games. And you're going to find as you learn more about game development or grow your interest in that, you're going to be less interested, or I'm sorry, less interested in the game journalistic side. And again, I mentioned crowdfunding earlier. This has become a popular option for smaller developers. There's also Patreon as well that some developers will use to help them fund their games. And the idea, of course, is that your fans will fund your project for you. And there is an entire Pandora's box of discussions about crowdfunding. And the reason why I include it here is that if you're trying to kind of get started, or if you have a really serious idea that you've developed a prototype and you're at the point where you want to go all in or go further with it, you may want to look at this as an option because we have seen all manner, once again, of crazy game ideas come from Kickstarter or Indiegogo. But with that said, the crowdfunding bubble for game development kind of burst about 3 to 4 years ago. Today, you have to put in almost double or triple the effort in order for your Kickstarter or your crowdfunding game to succeed. And like I said, there is an entire discussion just on this one topic. Now, let's talk briefly about storefronts, because if you're going to make a game, you're going to need a place to sell it. While many people will still have a dedicated homepage or a game site, and I do recommend that, you still need to approach one of these stores in order for the mainstream market to find you and hopefully buy your game. And we start this topic with Steam. Steam is the 10 billion pound gorilla of the digital store marketplace. This was created by Valve, and originally nobody thought this was going to work. And everyone, including myself, were completely wrong. This is where people go to buy games on the computer and where a lot of indie devs have appeared. 5 to 10 years ago, going on Steam was akin to starring in a Broadway musical or being the lead in a Hollywood movie. And many of the developers who succeeded, who managed to make a living, they were the first ones to be on the Steam platform. Unfortunately, things have changed. Today, all you need is $100, and Steam will let you put whatever game you want on the store. There is no kind of vetting or kind of a quality control process. So being on Steam today doesn't mean as much, but it's still considered for consumers where they're going to go to buy your game. And if it's not on Steam, they may not ever look at your title no matter how great it would be. Now, of course, if you want to go at things from the mobile standpoint, we have the iOS store, Google Play, and this is predominantly or exclusively for mobile games. The big difference between mobile and something like Steam, is that you must submit your game and they will vet it. And if they don't like your game or they think there's anything wrong with it, you're not going up on the store. And you must constantly maintain your game with whatever is the latest phone versions to make sure that it can still be played. Because if it can't be played or you can't afford to update it anymore, they're taking it off the store. Now, another example that has kind of grown, it's still on the smaller side compared to Steam. Well, everyone's smaller compared to Steam these days, is GOG. And they're predominantly known for having classic games on there, but they have opened up their doors to independent developers. They're a little bit harder to get into. They will vet it, but it's still an option alongside Steam. Now, for other developers or other publishers, Origin is owned by EA. Uplay, and I believe they've actually changed their name, Ubisoft, I think about a week ago. I think they're now Uconnect or something else. I'll have to update this slide probably in the next few weeks. But their storefronts are more interested in the AAA companies, but they've also learned that indies can also attract people. So they've been more welcoming along those lines. Now, if you want a site that is exclusively by indies for indies, that is itch.io. And they are nowhere near as big or as, they're going to make your games famous as some of the other storefronts, but they allow everything. And I mean literally everything. I have seen game jam or student projects go up on the store. And this is a way of kind of essentially having an online portfolio that you could maybe sell. You set the price of your game. You could put your games up for $0. People can tip you. And this is a great kind of, dipping your toe into getting into game development kind of route. Now, again, if you're hoping to make a living off of itch, it is most likely not going to happen because there are so many games on there that unless your game blows up big time, it's going to just get, kind of flooded alongside everybody else. The Humble Bundle is another option. The Humble Bundle grew having like bundles of popular games for charity, and they have since opened up their doors as an exclusive storefront. Going into a bundle is very risky because it's hard to get money that way. But if you just want to have another store option, Humble does that, and they have also opened up a publishing wing for independent developers. So they may actually, if your game idea is good enough or you can prove it to them, they may help fund your game and sell it at the same time. The Humble store also has kind of the, I think it's called the Humble widget that you can put on your own site. So they'll kind of handle the selling and logistics of your game as well. And that is kind of like an advanced topic that we do not have the time to get into in this presentation. But a few minutes ago, I mentioned Epic with Unreal. And Epic has been pushing into their own storefront with the Epic Games Store. Their big thing is that they will only take a 12% of any revenue that's earned, while Steam takes, I think, a 30 or 33%. And it has kind of led into a quote-unquote digital store war between the Valve and Epic that at this moment shows no signs of stopping. And in the next year or two, I may have to update this presentation and give Epic more of a front and center. We just don't know at this time. And consoles have been also opening things up for independent developers. PSN, Nintendo eShop, Xbox Live have become options for publishing indie games. You do have to get your game certified to be on a console, but it is another potential market, and we have seen indie games that have done well on the PC get ported to the consoles and have even more success. Hollow Knight, Stardew Valley, Darkest Dungeon have all had their ports do incredibly well. Now, networking is another big point about this industry, especially on the independent space. Many in the independent developer scene is kind of considered like a band of brothers and sisters these days, as like everyone kind of knows everybody else. And if you want to break in and especially get help from them, you have to do networking. Now, obviously, with the pandemic going on, major conferences aren't happening, or at least not happening in the same ways as they were before, but I will have some examples in the next few slides. And there's also state and local organizations and groups you can reach out to as well. So a big one, or one of the biggies, is PAX. That stands for the Penny Arcade Expo. This is kind of the biggest consumer show for consumers. developers and publishers will come here to show off their games, and it's also open to just about everyone. They normally have, I know they have PAX East and PAX West on a year-by-year basis, and I'm sure they have other examples throughout the world as well. GDC, or the Game Developers Conference, is the industry show. This is where developers and people who make games get together to talk about being developers and making games. They have the GDC Vault, where they put up a lot of their presentations, some for free, some for paid. And it is unfortunately very expensive to head out there. But shows like this are basically where you get to mingle with the people who are trying to make a living or who have made a living. And it's kind of considered almost like a requirement at some point to go, or at least watch the talks out of it. E3 is the trade show by the publishing or kind of the commercial side. This has opened up as well over the last few years, and this is where big name studios get together to show off their big name games. And even though companies such as Nintendo may not have an actual booth there, kind of the E3 season is where, we see big name announcements. And it's kind of like the Hollywood or the glitz and glamour to go to E3. Now, with that said, it's kind of to begin to wrap up our talk. I'm going to show you some important sites and places where you can go to learn more about the industry. And there is information out there. It's hard to find credible, but there are still sites that you can learn from. And many developers may have their own blogs where they'll talk more about the design process. And you can also reach out to people on Twitter or, Facebook or other groups as well to start learning. Now, a big one is the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association. It's the closest the industry has come to having a formal organization. There are no unions in the game dev space as of this time, but there have been talks about growing one. But every state, as well as globally, have IGDA chapters. They're kind of run at the local level, but this is a great way to start networking and start talking to people who have your same interests. You can sign up for a formal membership at the IGDA, but they also have special interest groups, and it's a great way to kind of network with like-minded individuals. Now, for news and kind of like the trade news of the industry, there is Gamma Sutra, and they have a blogging section. I kind of got started there myself. And people found me through Gamma Sutra to do writing for them. And that's kind of how I even started to write my first 2 books, by being noticed on there. But if you're looking for kind of the professional side of the industry news, this is a good place to visit on a day-to-day basis. And of course, there are plenty of books out there about game design. These are a few of the examples, and there are many, many more to go. I read from my 3rd book, one about procedural generation that was done by Tanya Short, and this list will probably grow even more for years to come as more people start to talk about game development. As I said earlier with the GDC Vault, there are more videos than I think we will ever have time to watch. But if you want to learn about a particular topic for somebody who has done it, there is probably a video in the vault for it. Now, it can be expensive to sign up, but there are so many free videos that I'm sure you'll be able to find something to learn from and get useful information by. But with all that said, and I can't view a clock, and I feel like I've been ranting for a long time, to wrap up this presentation, game development is a passionate industry. Nobody gets into video games as, their plan B or the lesser job. And that passion has led to many success, but it can be blinding as well. I've seen people will just say, I don't care about making a living, I just want to make games. And unfortunately, those people end up failing, because you need to understand the business as well as the art, or as I've said with Game Wisdom, the art and science of games. because there is a science to this. We can see and know what trends kind of are part of popular games or what is popular in game development today. And if you don't learn those lessons, you could end up making a game that is a failure, and you will not know it until you release it and nobody buys it, or the people who do buy it hate it. And it's something that I've said a lot when I talk about game development. I can look at a game these days and within 20 minutes know whether or not it's going to succeed or fail. And it's that kind of case of death by 1,000 cuts. That if one thing is done poorly, it means something else was done poorly. And ultimately, start learning. As I've said, for the teenagers and students watching this right now, you have an immeasurable advantage over everybody else. You can fail now while it's safe to do it. You can start trying different parts of the game development now while you're still in school. And this is the best time to learn what you can and can't do. Because if you can learn this now, it will make things so much easier for you when you get to college or if you go beyond that. Because there are people who have started game development the second they get out of college, and there are people who have quit a job to get into game development. And for them, they're going to be in that position of, I want to experiment and build a game, but I also need food and I need to pay my electricity bill this month as well. But being able to learn this now will get you so much further than everybody else, including myself. And I have seen games from like high school and people just starting out that I enjoy and were more impressive than games from industry veterans who are making their first independent game, because they are taking the lessons and they did the legwork to learn what it's like to make games today, and they are running with it. And if you can do that, it's going to help you out so much. And this will be my official final point. Game development is risky. And like I said, you can do everything right and fail, and you can do everything wrong, succeed. But ultimately, the people who do end up succeeding and living off of the game industry are the ones who learn how to mitigate that risks. They do all the work to make sure that their game's the best it can be. They do all the PR and the marketing so that people know about it. They understand all the angles of what it means to succeed. And they may still end up failing or not doing as well. But at the end of the day, they are the people who have the greatest chance of being in this industry for years to come. And if you can get to that point, then there are people who would kill to be in that position. But with that said, before I kind of, do my final introduction or, my final publicity, are there any questions that came in?
Josh, let's see here. We got some thank yous.
Oh,
But I
thank
don't
you.
have any specific questions. Does anybody have any questions? Put them in the Q&A.
And while we're looking, I'm going to just drink as much as I can because my throat is just completely parched.
I know, catch your breath, take a minute. I'm always curious about how people get started in things. So I was wondering about your particular story. Did you start out designing games or how did you get interested?
In terms of interest, I've always been playing video games. I started when I was 3 years old, a long, long time ago. And when I got into high school, I dabbled in programming. I tried doing it more in college. And I found that for kind of how I approach things, my mind was just not working with it. People have been telling me, they've been asking me to get back into game development. So I may try using Unity or doing some game dev streaming. But I did do a Q&A or beta testing for a studio. This was like early 2002, 2003. I started writing more professionally about the game industry in 2008, and then Game Wisdom was officially launched in 2012. And then kind of from there is when I started to reach out to developers and interview them. And like I said at the start, a lot of where my knowledge comes from is being able to talk with them. And when I show on the next slide my YouTube channel or the link to it, there are hundreds of hours of interviews on there of talking to developers and being able to bounce these ideas off of them. And that's kind of where this whole like theory of game design came from, that there are, commonalities between what made, game A succeed and game B succeed, or why this game failed and this one didn't. And I do believe that game design, like formally, will become, accepted profession. It's just going to take a lot of time.
Mhm. And what do you feel like is in changes for the game industry in the near future? Seems like the technology is changing so much.
Yeah.
Can you predict like where the industry is headed?
I hope any of my followers are watching this live record, because I'm sure they're going to make fun of me for any predictions I try to make. VR has been kind of, ebbing and flowing over the last like 2 or 3 years, and people have been trying to make that its own big thing. I'm still very skeptical of it myself, but I know developers who have been trying to approach that. And as we are sitting here, like for those of you watching this record, I know the PlayStation 5 and the new Xbox are going to be due out, I think, very, very soon. And that is going to mark the next kind of console development cycle. So we still don't know what's going to come from that. From the independent space, the big thing right now is Epic and what they're doing with Unreal and how they're trying to grow their own store. Because how you buy games is kind of been the biggest trend over the last 10 years. And like I said, like 10, 15 years ago, the thought of you just posting your game on Steam or on a digital store, that was not going to happen. Nobody ever thought that was going to be possible. Today, that is considered acceptable, that, a lot of people, they don't care about GameStop. They don't care about Walmart or any major retailer. They go to Steam, and that's where they earn their living from. And if Epic can compete with them, and we've seen competitors before and they've kind of all fallen behind, that could be a huge shakeup for kind of the store side of things going forward.
Why are you skeptical about VR? What is it about the technology that makes you hesitate?
The big thing is that what kind of games are going to work in VR that can't be done anywhere else. This past year, there was a game, Half-Life Alyx, which is based off the very recognizable Half-Life series, that has kind of become the gold standard of VR. But we've yet to see somebody say, you need to buy this headset, you need to get VR to play this. And until VR has that killer app that, everybody and anyone wants to play, and that's cheap enough to afford to use it, I just don't see it from a game dev space. Now, of course, VR has other applications. There's no doubt about that. And one of my presentations kind of talks about it. But we've yet to see, VR become, required for video games.
It's almost like you have to envision a whole different paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question here from Lincoln. Will Microsoft's Game Pass work in a way the indies will make money since games are offered as a flat monthly fee?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. For those of you watching this who don't know what he's referring to, the Games Pass or Game Pass is the idea of having a subscription service to play video games. Think of it as like a Netflix or a Hulu account. So instead of me buying a game for $20, $30, $40, it's I spend $15, $20 a month, and all the games that are available on that service, I can play them whenever I want. When a game gets taken down, I can't play it anymore, but then something else goes up. And what Microsoft's Game Pass, they've been doing a lot of pushing that. I know they have a special deal with the next Xbox, which I think is very interesting, that you can kind of finance the system and you'll get the Games Pass along with it. And to his question about the independent space, that is a tough one. Part of the problem is that, like I said, traditionally, I hand you money, you hand me my game. That's the whole profit. With the Games Pass, you get paid basically based on the metrics of that pass, which is usually how long somebody spends on your game. So you can have 100,000 people play your game, but they may only spend a minute on your game or 2 minutes on it. You're not going to earn a lot of money from that. And a lot of people, a lot of developers I've spoken to are very worried that's going to lead into that, peaks and valleys or hills and valleys kind of mindset that 2 or 3 games are going to do amazingly well. Everybody else is going to suffer. And the kind of example that people have been keeping an eye on is the Google Arcade, or I'm sorry, not Google Arcade, the Apple Arcade and Google Stadia. And Stadia kind of, people were, losing their minds over it, and then it just quietly disappeared. While the Apple Arcade has been the attempt at mobile to have, premium mobile games. And I don't know how well that's doing at this moment, but it's still very risky to kind of tether your game to something else. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned the Humble Bundle, and that was another one of those issues that you go into that bundle with 10 other people. If that bundle earns, $50,000, that money is split 10 different ways, as well as Humble taking a share, as well as a charity. So you may end up having like 20 cents per copy sold, and nobody can make a living off of 20 cents of a copy for their games being sold that way.
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier how, for better or worse, making games is so much more accessible to the average person. You don't have to. And I was just thinking about Silicon Valley and venture capitalists and how, like, some of the pushback they've gotten is it tends to be a lot of men, particularly white men, deciding who gets funding and whatever. So I'm wondering if you've seen over the past years with gaming becoming so accessible, if you're seeing the demographics change and who's making the games and the content.
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely. The answer to that is yes. The independent space has become very diverse over the last 10 years. I've seen many women, people of color. There are a lot of LGBTQ plus games and developers in that space. A lot of them do not blow up in terms of recognition, unfortunately, but it has, again, that the creative outlet of the independent scene has afforded a lot of people to get in. I have spoken to developers literally all around the world. I spoke to somebody from India, Africa. I even know a developer from Jamaica who was making a game. And there are lots of titles. A part of it has been, again, the personal or the passionate side that has led to developers making a game to tell a story, whether it's a story that's very personal to them or very private, or just wanting to make something that they can say, this is me in a nutshell. And there are still a lot of, it has become very, I guess, heated in terms of people arguing about, what is a game, what isn't a game. There was this whole issue called, sadly, Gamergate, that I don't know how big it blew up in the mainstream about 4 or 5 years ago, that we're still seeing reverberations from. And unfortunately, there are still people sadly being attacked, for the color of their skin or their gender. But the independent space as a whole has become very open to that. There are many special interest groups and communities around people of color, around women in the game industry, again, LGBTQ plus, and it has become very popular. Again, this has been one of the reasons why we've seen that push towards the independent space, is that it's still very much, if we look at major companies, the 18 to 30 straight white male demographic. In the independent space, it is everybody of all walks of life, all gender, nationality, etc.
We have a question here from Sean, who asks or says, there was a game developer by the name Chris Sawyer who single-handedly created the first roller coaster tycoon games by himself in 1999. Realistically, today, would you say it's possible or even recommended to develop a title by oneself, or would you recommend joining/creating a team of developers in the current state of the game industry?
Yeah, and that is a tricky question, again, by the fact that, again, there is no one size fits all. Like everything that I say, there will always be exceptions to this rule, and there will always be things that prove this rule. Today, it is possible to at least start making games on your own, especially smaller titles. You are going to need to have that background, though, that especially programming. If you cannot program, you are not going to be able to develop a game, period. But we do see many developers go the tabletop route, and tabletop can be done by yourself. That is just paper, cards and paper. You can build something, and we've seen people go or grow in the tabletop community. Interestingly, tabletop is now the biggest seller on Kickstarter. Like it has become the kind of the renaissance of tabletop games through using crowdfunding. Now, as for developing a title by yourself or joining a team, that is, I think, going to depend on two things. Your own mindset, or whether or not you can work with other people, which unfortunately we have seen developers who cannot, cooperate with other people. We've seen, the quote unquote rock star developer kind of burn out. It also depends on the scope of the project as well. And we've seen very experimental titles start out as coming from a single or, a 2 to 3 person group. Game jams can be, as I said earlier, a great way to kind of test an idea. And if you want to find a team, there are people out there. And again, every team is going to be different. And you're going to have to, no matter how small or big you're going to work with, most likely you're going to have to wear those different hats. What I've seen from most of the independent space is usually, like on the small side, it can be between 1 and 5 people on a team, and maybe like 15 to 20 on the independent side. We're not talking, AAA. When we get to like 30 plus, that's when it becomes a lot harder to manage. And again, it really is going to come down to the kind of game you want to make and what your skills are. And I guess the final point for this question is that if there's something that you cannot do, try to find somebody to complement your skills for it. If you are a really great programmer, but you can't do art, get yourself an artist, because people will look for any weak points in your game. If your game is programmed well, but it looks horrible, they're not going to buy it. And for a lot of developers, for a lot of programmers, they will probably have to find artists and vice versa. And in some cases, you may need to find somebody who does the PR side or the marketing side. And that's another 2-hour discussion we have about the nightmares of PR and marketing in this industry.
All right. Well, we've been making you talk now for an hour and a half, and it looks like we've hit all the questions. So do you have any final words of wisdom for us before we go on our way?
Yeah, sure. I have just a few of my kind of like promotional stuff. So Amy mentioned my two books at the start of this presentation. 20 Essential Games to Study is kind of the entry level book for developers. It's kind of like, I'm looking to be inspired. What are some games that are so unique or different that I can kind of get my creative juices flowing? And in that book, I went through 20 of my favorite games, or 20 of the most, influential or groundbreaking in their own right, to kind of inspire you on. And then the series I'm working on right now, Game Design Deep Dive, that is more aimed at, I would say, the student/professional level. Each book is basically a top to bottom look at the design of a specific genre. I talk about the history of it. I talk about what are the major cues, or like I said earlier, like the science that goes into these mechanics and gameplay loop. What works, what doesn't. So the first book in that series is Platformers. I have officially finished the manuscript for the next book, which is going to be looking at the roguelike genre. That is due out early 2021. And then I'm also planning book number, I guess officially book number 4, which will be all about horror games. And I have no idea when that one's going to do out because I haven't even started to write it yet. So it's coming at some point. And if you want to follow me or my work, game-wisdom.com is my main site, and the YouTube channel, definitely check that out. Again, I'm kind of self-plugging myself here, but that's where I have my daily videos on design topics and theories. That's where the bulk of my interviews and talks with developers come from. You can follow me on Twitter at GW and if you want to send me a message on there, feel free. My inbox is open. If you have any questions you want me to answer, if there's anything that I didn't cover that you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. And these presentations always get updated as new information comes about. And I will be more than happy, and I will most likely be updating this presentation, who knows, in the next few weeks or months. And as I talk with Amy about as well, I have other presentations. So if you're interested in them, I am more than happy to come back on and talk. And if you want to get those books, my publisher, CRC Press, and I will put the actual link to it because I know they do have kind of inspector copies, and they may also work with libraries and schools on the books as well. Here is, if I can find it like super quickly. Here it is.
Chatting to each other, saying we should buy these books for the library.
Here is the link to the site for 20 Essential Games. There's also, you'll find the other ones as well. And I do know they work with schools, libraries, and stuff like that on deals and such.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Josh. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you again for responding to my email while I was posting about it for virtual presentations. If there's any schools or libraries watching this, recorded or whatever, who would like me to come and talk, I am open. So please get in touch with me.
Great. And for anyone who didn't make the video, it'll be on our YouTube channel and you can watch it at your leisure.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming virtually to visit us. And I hope all is well with you in New Jersey.
Yep, I am hanging in there.